Chumo, Maina, Horongoro. These are age-set names among the Kalenjin, the Abakuria, and the Abagusi. 100 is Pogol in Kalenjin, Bokol in Somali, 10 is Taman and Toban, Rain, Ropta, and Rob. The Beehive, Moinget to the Kalenjin, Miringamo to the Irako, and Meringo to the Aramanic. These linguistic similarities reveal deep ancient connections that link communities across vast distances in East Africa. The Western Bantu farmers in the Lake Victoria Basin, Eastern Cushites in the Somali deserts, Southern Cushites in the northern Tanzania highlands, and Southern Nilotes in Kenya's Rift Valley. But how did this come to be? The answer? Kalenjin people of modern Kenya represent one of East Africa's most historically significant highland Nilotic populations. Their story of migration, adaptation, and cultural evolution spanning over 3 millennia. Today numbering approximately 6.3 million people across Kenya's western highlands and the Rift Valley, the Kalenjin comprise of multiple related groups including the Kipsigis, the Nandi, the Tugen, the Keyo, the Marakwet, the Pokot, and the Sabaot. Yet the collective name Kalenjin, derived from the Nandi phrase meaning I say to you, emerged only in the mid-20th century. Before this modern consolidation, these communities shared deep linguistic and cultural roots stretching back to the proto-Nilotic peoples of ancient Sudan. Their history represents a remarkable narrative of pastoral expansion, cultural exchange, and resilient adaptation across the diverse landscapes of East Africa. Because of the lack of written documents about this history, historians have often relied on linguistic and oral traditions to mark the Kalenjin history. The Kalenjin story begins around the Bahr el Ghazal region of what is now South Sudan, where between 3000 and 1000 BCE, a distinct linguistic community known as proto-Nilotes emerged. These ancestors of all modern Nilotic peoples developed a sophisticated pastoral culture fundamentally centered on cattle herding. The central importance of cattle in proto-Nilotic life remains evident in the extraordinary complexity of their livestock vocabulary. Specialized terms for cattle breeds, color variations, horn configurations, and age categories that persist among their descendants like the Nuer tribe. Proto-Nilotic society was characterized by a mixed economy that combined cattle pastoralism with grain cultivation, particularly finger millet, supplemented by fishing and exchange for food crops with neighboring populations. Their social organization featured patrilineal descent, polygamous marriage practices, and linear-age systems marked by ceremonial initiations. Politically, these early Nilotic communities were largely acephalous, lacking centralized authority and instead organizing themselves through councils of elders and clan structures. Leadership could emerge situationally during the dry season when families congregated around scarce water sources under the leadership of clan chiefs. The Proto-Nilotes practiced transhumance, a cyclical migration pattern between lowland and highland areas dependent upon seasonal variations in water and grass availability. During dry seasons, extended families gathered around permanent wetlands or elevated areas with higher rainfall, creating conditions for greater political organization. When the rains came, groups dispersed widely across the lowlands where abundant water and grass were available, with rising floodwaters often separating different communities and limiting centralized political development. Proto-Nilotic religious beliefs centered on non-theistic spirituality, focused on animistic forces that permeated nature. Ritual specialists, who would later be known among different groups as the Laibons or Coyotes or by other titles, possessed the ability to channel this supernatural power for healing, divination, and blessing. Material culture included the use of Sanga kettle indigenous to Africa, iron working by around 1400 to 500 BCE, pottery production, and a preference for spears over bows as weapons. Cattle provided not just food through meat, blood, and milk, but also materials for bedding, clothing, tools, and even building materials from dung and bones, making them absolutely central to both material and social reproduction. By approximately 1000 BCE, the Proto-Nilotic community had begun differentiating into three major subfamilies. Western Nilotes, also called the Riverlet Nilotes, who would remain near the River Nile and the Sudan Plains. Eastern Nilotes, who would dominate Lake Turkana region and the highlands of southern Ethiopia. And Southern Nilotes, the ancestors of the Kalenjin. The Southern Nilotic branch formed a distinct distinct linguistic community between 800 and 500 BCE in the region between the Nile River and Lake Turkana, gradually spreading southward into northern Kenya around the Mount Elgon region. The development of the Southern Nilotic identity occurred across three distinct phases. During the early pre-Southern Nilotic period, the communities maintained the basic pastoral and social patterns of their proto-Nilotic ancestors. They kept cattle and goats, likely cultivated sorghum and other grains, and combined pastoralism with hunting and gathering. Their society featured no hereditary chiefs, maintained linear age-set systems, lived in dispersed family homesteads rather than nucleated villages, and practiced the extraction of lower incisors during adolescence, a custom still common among Nilotic peoples. They occupy the dry belt stretching from northern Kenya and Lake Turkana westward toward the Nile River, positioning them at the southern fringes of the Ethiopian highlands, where their northern neighbours were the early eastern Cushitic peoples. The middle pre-Southern Nilotic period witnessed profound cultural transformation through intense contact with the eastern Cushitic populations of southern Ethiopia and northern Kenya. This interaction proved so influential that it fundamentally reshaped southern Nilotic society in ways not experienced by any other Nilotic branch. Southern Nilotes adopted male circumcision and clitoridectomy, practices widespread amongst eastern Cushites but absent from original Nilotic traditions. They also adopted the Cushitic fish avoidance taboo and, most significantly, the distinctive cyclical age-set system that would become central to Kalenjin social organization. Linguistic evidence for this cultural exchange is striking. Eastern Cushites influenced even the most basic Southern Nilotic vocabulary, with loanwords including words for 10, 50, 100, rain, among others. This extensive borrowing suggests a long-term relationship comparable to situations where marginalized groups borrow heavily from a dominant neighbor. Yet, despite this intense contact, the Southern Nilotes maintained their linguistic identity and eventually emerged as an independent, influential population. The late pre-Southern Nilotic period saw these populations move from their earlier Ethiopian-influenced homeland into Kenya's Rift Valley and Western Highlands, bringing them into contact with the Southern Cushitic peoples, particularly speakers of the Rift Southern Cushitic language. Southern Cushites were among the earliest migrants into present-day Kenya around 4,000 years ago from the Ethiopian highlands. This relocation would bring the Southern Nilotes into contact with the Bantu-speaking migrants advancing northward from the south. By this period, Southern Nilotes were also engaging with Eastern Nilotes to their north, sharing vocabulary related to harmed cattle and iron working that spread across both regions simultaneously. They were aware of iron, but linguistic evidence shows that they likely did not use the iron hoe. The absence of a shared Southern Nilotic or even shared Kalenjin word for home, combined with multiple and related Bantu loanwords for the iron hoe, strongly suggests that the iron hoe was a later adoption via Bantu peoples, probably not widespread until the last millennium. During this phase, Southern Nilotic society was not a single unified population, but rather a cluster of related dialect communities. One branch developed into the Proto-Southern Nilotes, the ancestor of all modern Southern Nilotic languages. Other branches, once spoken in the regions east and southeast of Lake Victoria and across central southern Kenya, have left no surviving descendants. The Victoria pre-Southern Nilotes, a major population living east and southeast of Lake Victoria, coexisted with and sometimes dominated early Bantu migrants before eventually being absorbed, leaving their mark through cyclical age systems adopted by groups like the Kuria and the Zanaki, and through rich layers of Southern Nilotic loanwords in the Gusii, as well as Bantu dialects of Musoma, Gisu, and Luya. Similarly, in central southern Kenya and around Kilimanjaro, Southern Nilotic groups maintained long-term interactions with the Tagishu, the ancestors to the Kikuyu and the Akamba, and the Maasai peoples, evidenced by loanwords dating to different historical periods. Over time, other Southern Nilotic groups remained in southern Kenya and northern Tanzania, but were increasingly pushed back by expanding Bantu and Eastern Nilotic populations. The Proto-Southern Nilotes subsequently divided into three major branches: the Datoga, who would migrate southward into Tanzania in the first millennia, the Kenya Kadam, who pushed northward and west toward eastern Uganda, but disappeared early, replaced by an expanding Karamojong and Teso-speaking population, and the Pre-Colonial society, who would remain in Kenya, establishing the foundation of the communities we recognize today. The end of the late pre-Southern Nilotic period marked both the close of an early settlement era and the start of a new historical phase Nilotes, in which the southern Nilotes competed not just with Cushites but also eastern Nilotes and Bantu peoples. Pre-Colonial society. This period would see the emergence of the Proto-Kalenjin and the Kitoki Southern Nilotes. The Kitoki Southern Nilotic group spread across the western highlands around Mount Elgon, but were gradually absorbed by the expanding Luya and Gisu Bantus, and are related to modern-day Tachoni and Kalenjin. Their influence survives in widespread Kitoki borrowings in early Luya vocabulary, with Bukusu evidence suggesting Kitoki languages lasted in Bungoma until the 17th century. Culturally, Kitoki groups resembled other southern Nilotes, with strong cattle traditions, possible reliance on bananas and root crops, and an 8-age set system. The Proto-Kalenjin would emerge around 500 CE. The southern Nilotes who had migrated into northwestern Kenya, settling between the Winam Gulf and Mount Elgon and into the North Rift Valley, began a new phase of their history. The Proto-Kalenjin economy was centered fundamentally on cattle pastoralism, with cattle providing not merely subsistence through milk, blood, and occasionally meat, but serving crucial social functions as bride wealth and dispute settlement. Unlike some other Nilotic groups who relied more exclusively on pastoralism, the Proto-Kalenjin maintained a careful balance between herding and agriculture, cultivating grains such as sorghum and finger millet. They collected wild honey and brewed beer, practices that would remain culturally significant. Cattle acquisition occurred through 3 primary means: breeding, exchange, and raiding. Raiding being an accepted practice among pastoralist communities throughout the region. The social backbone of the Proto-Kalenjin society was the cyclical age-set system, with age-set transitions occurring approximately every 12 to 15 years. Young boys and girls progressed through carefully defined life stages marked by elaborate initiation ceremonies, with circumcision rites signifying the crucial transition to adulthood. These age-grade systems created horizontal bonds across different clans, serving military, political, and social functions that transcend kinship ties and created cohesive units capable of collective action. Society organized itself into patrilineal clans, polygamous marriage practices being common, and the age-set system allowed for socio-cultural bonding and social harmony across community divisions. Politically, the Proto-Kalenjin remained acephalous, lacking formal centralized authority or bureaucratic state institutions. Instead, they governed themselves through council of elders, representing different clans and age sets. Decision-making was collective, with elders adjudicating disputes, organizing community activities, and making decisions affecting the community. This decentralized system would prove remarkably resilient, continuing to function even after the later imposition of colonial administration. Proto-Kalenjin religious life would be centered on belief in a creator deity named Asis, associated with the sun, along with various lesser nature-associated deities. Religious specialists served as diviners, ritual leaders, and intermediaries, the supernatural realm, channeling mystical energy for healing, blessing, and protection. These specialists would later gain increased political significance during periods of external threat. Material culture reflected both continuity with earlier Nilotic traditions and innovations. The Proto-Kalenjin developed ironworking skills, possibly learned from Bantu-speaking neighbours near Lake Victoria, creating pottery, tools, and weapons, including spears and shells. Their architecture consisted of semi-permanent structures suitable for their semi-nomadic lifestyle, with settlements typically located in defensible highland areas. By the start of the millennium, they lived in a belt stretching southwest from Mount Elgon into the Rift Valley, surrounded to the west by the Kitoki, Southern Nilotes, to the north by the Karamojong Nilotes, and to the west and southwest by various Bantu groups. The Proto-Kalenjin economy featured specific material technologies, reflecting their way of life. They used wooden bowls and beehives, multiple types of sacks, specialized containers for honey collection, quivers and scabbards for weapons, hollowed horns for various purposes, earthen cooking pots, and an elaborate array of calabashes for storing milk, beer, and palm wine. They knew yams and possibly knew of bananas, though they did not cultivate or rely on them. Their clothing came from animal hides, though they were aware of cloth. and they used copper ornaments, beads, ivory, and bells for decorations. Musical instruments included animal horns and a lyre, though they notably did not use drums. During this period, they encountered and gradually supplanted Southern Cushitic speakers who had previously inhabited these areas. The Proto-Kalenjin would further divide into the Proto-Nandi, South Kalenjin, the East Kalenjin, the Pokot, and the Sabaot, also called the Elgon Kalenjin. For the East Kalenjin, though Proto-Kalenjin diversified in western Kenya, their major expansion occurred along the Rift Valley, where modern East Kalenjin groups preserved traces of their early communities. Their dialects, such as Kamelilo and Eldamaravin, show long separation and varied external influences. Kamelilo reveals contact with the Sonjo Bantus of Tanzania and with an early Maasai-speaking population, reflected in archaic Maasai loanwords. As Maasai domination spread, most East Kalenjin pastoralists were absorbed, leaving small groups who kept fragments of their early Kalenjin language, despite major cultural change. For the Southern Kalenjin, the language is now preserved only in the Akie dialect of southern Tanzania, but was once the most widely spoken Kalenjin variety. Southern Kalenjin speakers initially lived south-central Kenya beside the East Kalenjin, but began expanding southward into Tanzania well before the mid-first millennium, eventually spreading across what would become known as Maasai land in northern and central Tanzania. As South Kalenjin communities spread across this vast region, they assimilated the Datooga speakers who had previously occupied much of the region, interacted with southern Cushitic populations, and established contact with Bantu peoples whose language resembled present-day Zigula. The borrowed terms in Akie for everyday items such as eggs demonstrate meaningful interactions with the Bantu groups. Southern Cushitic loanwords point to a once significant Cushitic food-producing community in southern Maasai land, though these words may also reflect the former language of hunting populations before they absorbed Kalenjin speech. The Southern Kalenjin influence on the early Maasai was significant, evidenced by the extensive Maasai vocabulary, apart from cattle terms, borrowed from South Kalenjin. This indicates that South Kalenjin communities were once widespread in areas later occupied by the Maasai and may have reshaped early Maasai culture. South Kalenjin communities were cattle keepers whose mobility facilitated their rapid spread across Tanzania, though their cultivation vocabulary appears largely borrowed, particularly words for grains such as pearl millet and sorghum, from a Maasai-related dialect that practiced agriculture. This suggests that Maasai land saw at least two Maasai-speaking expansions, an early agricultural phase and the later pastoral Maasai known today, the Aramanik. In addition to South Kalenjin, a second Kalenjin-speaking population may have reached far into central Tanzania. Aramanik, a southern Cushitic language, contains Kalenjin loanwords that show features typical in East Kalenjin or Nandi, not South Kalenjin. These include the use of Nandi or East Kalenjin suffix yo instead of South Kalenjin yan. This suggests a previously unknown Kalenjin group in central Tanzania, whose movements need to be integrated into the already complex population history of the Maasai steppe. Further study of the Aramani vocabulary may help determine whether this was an East Kalenjin or Nandian expansion or an early stage of the South Kalenjin before key sound changes occurred. During the first half of the second millennium, the Proto-Kalenjin community underwent a gradual process of geographic dispersal and linguistic differentiation that would create the distinct Kalenjin groups recognized today. This breakup occurred through migration and dialectic differentiation over several centuries, with communities settling in different ecological zones and developing independent identities while maintaining sufficient linguistic similarity to preserve mutual intelligibility. The period from 1500 to 1800 CE would witness the consolidation of the distinct Kalenjin group identities and increasingly complex interactions with their neighboring peoples. The emerging Kalenjin groups established themselves across specific territories. The Sabaot, or the Elgon Kalenjin, including the Koni, the Sabini, and the Bok, remained closest to their ancestral homeland around Mount Elgon, maintaining particularly strong cultural connections to the mountain that featured prominently in their oral traditions and religious practices. The Pokot migrated to areas around Cherangani and into regions north of Mount Elgon, where intense contact with the expanding Karamojong and Teso peoples from the north would significantly influence their culture. This contact resulted in the adoption of distinctive cultural traits, including specific styles of shields, lip plugs, and hairstyles, and the loss of cyclical edge sets characteristic of other Kalenjin groups. The Pokot also maintained a more mobile pastoralist lifestyle than most other Kalenjin groups. The Proto-Nandian dialects became the Nandi, migrating to Uasin Gishu Plateau and surrounding areas. The Nandi emerged as one of the most militarily powerful Kalenjin groups. Their strategic location and organizational capacity allowed them to control extensive territories and conduct long-distance raids. The Nandi developed a strong Orkoyot institution, with ritual leaders playing increasingly important political roles. Kipsigis, moving south to what is now Kericho County, the Kipsigis became the largest Kalenjin group numerically. They occupied fertile highlands, ideal for mixed farming and large-scale cattle keeping. The Kipsigis oral traditions describe migration from the north, possibly involving several waves of movement over multiple generations. The Keyo and the Marakwet, who settled in the Kerio Valley along the Elgeyo Escarpment, developed remarkable adaptations to this dramatic topographical feature. They practiced a form of transhumance between the valley floor, used primarily for dry season grazing, and the escarpment ledges and highlands, used for settlement and cultivation. They would develop specialized economic strategies suited to their environment, including irrigation, agriculture, along the Kerio River tributaries. The Tugen, settling in the Baringo Basin and surrounding highlands. The Tugen developed close relationships with neighboring groups including other Kalenjin, like the Maasai and the Turkana. Their territory encompassed diverse ecological zones from lake shores to highlands, requiring flexible economic strategies. The Terik, a small group settling near the Nandi Escarpment. The Terik occupied a strategic position between the Kalenjin heartland and the Luya territories. Despite their small population, they maintained their distinct identity through endogamous marriage practices and strong clan structures. The Enderois, traditionally occupying land around Lake Bogoria and nearby areas. The Enderois developed specialized fishing and pastoralist practices suited to the lake environment. They maintained particularly important salt extraction industries at Lake Bogoria. Oral traditions across various Kalenjin groups consistently identify Mount Elgon, called Tuluop Konyi in Kalenjin languages, as an ancestral homeland. From this core area, communities gradually dispersed throughout the Kenyan highlands, following the Great Rift Valley's ecological zones that provided ideal conditions for their pastoral agricultural lifestyle. This expansion occurred gradually over several centuries, driven by multiple factors including population pressure as communities grew, need for more grazing land and agricultural fields, environmental factors such as drought or disease outbreaks affecting livestock, social dynamics including disputes within communities or desire for independence, and economic opportunities in the search for better pastures, water sources, and agricultural land. The Kalenjin displayed remarkable adaptability to diverse environments, from the highlands of the Mao Escarpment to the floor of the Rift Valley, developing sophisticated knowledge of local ecology and identifying optimal locations for settlement, grazing, and cultivation. Despite their geographical separation and the development of distinct dialects, these groups maintained cultural continuity through several mechanisms, such as shared age-set names that rotated through the same cycle across different groups, intermarriage that created kinship networks transcending group boundaries, regular trading relationship, mutual defense, alliances during periods of external threat, shared religious practices, and periodic joint ceremonies, and maintained linguistic intelligibility that facilitated communication and a sense of common identity. Kalenjin interactions with Bantu-speaking neighbours, including the Luya, the Gusi, and the Kikuyu, involved complex patterns of trade in agricultural products, with Bantu farmers often producing bananas, tubers, and other crops that complemented Kalenjin grain and pastoral products. Intermarriage, particularly of Kalenjin men and Bantu women, created kinship ties and facilitated cultural exchange. Periodic conflicts over land and resources occurred as populations grew, but cultural borrowings also took place, including the adoption of certain crops and influence of Bantu political systems on some Kalenjin groups. Contact with Bantu speakers near Lake Victoria had earlier influenced the Nandi and other Kalenjin groups in the adoption of ironworking technologies and certain agricultural practices. The most significant and complex relationship developed with the Maasai-speaking Eastern Nilotic peoples, beginning in the 17th century and intensifying through the 18th and 19th century. The Maasai underwent aggressive expansion that eventually saw them dominating much of Rift Valley from Lake Lake Turkana to central Tanzania. This expansion brought them into direct contact and often conflict with the Kalenjin, fundamentally reshaping the political and demographic landscape of the region. The Iloikop Wars of the 19th century represented a series of conflicts, primarily among various Ma-speaking groups themselves, but these wars significantly affected the Kalenjin as well. According to Nandi oral traditions, they strategically took advantage of the Maasai civil wars and subsequent demographic collapse caused by rinderpest, drought, and smallpox epidemics in the late 19th century to expand their own territory and cattle holdings, demonstrating their opportunistic adaptation that characterized Kalenjin political strategy. The Kalenjin also maintained relationship with various Cushitic-speaking groups and with other Nilotic people, including the Luo, the Turkana, and the Teso. These relationships involved extensive trade networks extending into South Sudan and Ethiopia, competition and occasional warfare over resources, cultural exchange, particularly in religious practices and material culture, and strategic alliances during conflicts with other groups. The Kalenjin demonstrated remarkable flexibility in their diplomatic and military strategies, forming alliances when beneficial and competing when necessary, always adapting to their shifting balance of power across the East African highlands and Rift Valley. By the late 18th century, the Kalenjin had become a major Rift Valley population, thriving through flexible mixed farming, strong edge-set institutions, and strategic diplomacy despite pressure from the Maasai and other neighbours. Their history highlights wider East African patterns of adaptation, migration, and cultural exchange, and on the eve of colonial rule, they would face new challenges, but they remained resilient and maintained a distinct Southern Nilotic identity. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and comment below. If you would like to learn more about pre-colonial African history, consider subscribing. Thank you for watching.